The UN Climate Change Conference is the largest gathering for climate action in the world. The first week of COP27 ongoing in Egypt kicked off with the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit, attended by over 120 world leaders who came together to discuss their wishes and concerns in the fight against climate change. At the start of the Implementation Summit, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated that humanity is on its way to climate hell.
And the clock is ticking. We are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell, with our foot still on the accelerator.
The geopolitical context which COP27 is taking place against the backdrop of this year is a fragile one. The global food and energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and growing US-China tensions have pushed climate change down the political agenda for several countries. This is as the effects of climate change continue to intensify. Leaders from developing and emerging economies urged rich nations who are most responsible for the climate crisis to deliver on promises.
We know what it is to put a man on the moon, and now we're putting rover on Mars. We know what it is. But the simple political will that is necessary, not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve, seems still not to be capable of being produced.
Africa contributes less than 3% of the pollution responsible for climate change, but is most severely impacted by the ensuing crisis. Africa. And it is therefore only fair and proper that this conference takes necessary measures to recognize Africa's special needs and circumstances.
Funding for loss and damage from developed wealthy nations whose historic and current activities have largely contributed to the climate crisis is on the agenda at COP27 for the first time. And although it's not on the official agenda, discussions on gas are ongoing at COP this year, as Europe seeks fresh supplies in the wake of tensions with Russia, and African leaders and negotiators argue that the continent should be allowed to use gas, a cleaner fossil fuel, to support its energy transition. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz warned against a fossil fuel renaissance.
We will move away from fossil fuels, no ifs, ands, or buts. There must be no worldwide renaissance in fossil energies. And speaking for Germany, I say this: it will not happen.
On climate finance, speaking to activists on the sidelines of COP, French President Emmanuel Macron said non-European rich nations like China and the US need to pay their fair share.
We need the United States and China to really be on board. If I were to simplify things on emissions, our battle is for the richest to be present, to pay their fair share, and on this point, let's be clear, I need us to say things: the Europeans pay, but we are the only ones to pay.
Arriving at the conference late, US President Joe Biden apologized for the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement in 2020.
The climate crisis is about human security, economic security, environmental security, national security, and the very life of the planet.
And US climate envoy John Kerry addressed global leaders, stating that the US is working as hard as it can to deliver President Biden's pledge to provide $11.4 billion a year by 2024 to help developing countries to green their economies.
Our administration is working as hard as we can to deliver on President Biden's pledge to quadruple climate support by 2024. And we are absolutely committed to doing our part. But even as we do that, I know that's not enough money.
His speech was interrupted by a climate activist who accused him of promoting false solutions.
This is what I was talking about.
Campaigners are known to hold demonstrations at annual COP events. This year, there are fewer demonstrations because of a crackdown on protests and dissent in Egypt, but protesters have still gathered outside the venue, even K-pop fans. The first week of COP27 saw South Africa sign a loan agreement with Germany and France for the two European nations to extend €300 million each in concessional financing to Africa's largest polluter. Climate finance is an important aspect of addressing the global climate crisis. However, there are concerns about the path to net zero, creating more debt for developing countries and emerging economies.
At the end of this session,
To accelerate climate finance and investment in green infrastructure in Africa, the African Development Bank, the AU and partners launched the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. The Africa Carbon Markets Initiative was also inaugurated this week, aiming to establish carbon credits as one of Africa's top export commodities by 2050. And the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda was announced, to enhance resilience for 4 billion people living in the most climate-vulnerable communities by 2030.
This agenda is a comprehensive, shared agenda to rally global action around 30 outcomes that are needed to address the adaptation gap and achieve a resilient world by 2030. The agenda aims at accelerating transformative action by countries, regions, cities, businesses, investors, and civil society to adapt to the acute climate hazards facing vulnerable communities.
Other agreements reached this week include the signing of a MOU between Israel, Jordan, and the UAE to develop a 600-megawatt solar photovoltaic, and governments representing over half of global GDP announced a plan to accelerate decarbonization of 5 major sectors. On the race to net zero, Chinese envoy Xi Zhenhua has stated that China is ahead of many developed countries in transitioning to renewable energies.
China's renewable energy reached 1.12 billion kWh by the end of last year. What does that mean? It means the combined installed capacity of renewable energy in many developed countries is less than that of China.
He also used the opportunity to reaffirm that the US-China climate accord is suspended.
When our cooperation was going very well, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives visited Taiwan. She violated China's sovereignty and hurt the feelings of Chinese people, violated the spirit of the 3 China-US joint communiques. So we announced the suspension of climate change cooperation with the United States. But who should be blamed for this? It is the United States.
Negotiations, discussions, and demonstrations will continue throughout the second and final week of COP. Thematic days on gender, water, energy, and biodiversity will also hold. There's been some progress, but the pledge of $100 billion in annual climate finance to developing countries has never been met. And there's no clear plan yet on doubling finance for adaptation by 2025. Just how much will be achieved remains to be seen. Leila Johnson Salami, Arise News.